meeting is being recorded, and by participating in the meeting, you're consenting to be recorded. The recordings will be posted on the task force website. We'll remind folks to please mute your microphone when you're not talking, just so we can hear clearly those who are presenting or talking. Upcoming meetings will be listed on the task force website, and task force members and presenters should be getting those calendar invites, as I mentioned earlier. There we go. And as I mentioned, we will have another session after this one. Our next scheduled session is on the 22nd, so we have a little bit of a hiatus. We've been moving at a breathless pace, and that will be with the legal service providers. And we had our housing providers here yesterday, so thank you to Pam and Luke for arranging that for us. There'll be time after the presentation for task force members and others to ask questions and any discussion. And so we're asking folks, as you know, to go ahead and put those questions in the chat if things arise as the presentation is unfolding. Leia's kindly been capturing those. Some folks have reached out to me directly with questions. If you can put them in the chat, that's helpful, just so we have a little bit of, so folks can see that or whatever and know what questions are in the queue. All right, with that, the housekeeping things aside, we're going to begin today, and I'm very pleased to have with us Carol Gilbert, who is the Assistant Secretary for, I may get this wrong, Carol, for Community Development and Revitalization, is that correct?
Close, just neighborhood revitalization, but that's close enough.
Neighborhood revitalization, okay. In the Department of Housing and Community Development for our state. And so Carol and her colleagues will be presenting today. They've been really at the crux of the rental assistance, at getting that rental assistance out to tenants in need. And they're going to get to talk to us a little bit about, how that effort's been going and also how they've fashioned that to get the word out as well as getting the resources out to Marylanders. So without further ado, Carol, please.
Yeah, thank you, Vicki, and thank you, task force members, for your work on this important initiative. My name is, Vicki noted, it's Carol Gilbert. And my team at the Department of Housing is focused on deploying community development and revitalization resources, and also importantly, community services resources such as housing counseling and legal services funding, and community action agency funding, and homeless prevention funding. That team is led by Stuart Campbell, who's joining us on this call today, and Danielle Meister is his lead director for many things, and including the deployment of Ewrap. And she's going to be our lead presenter today, addressing the questions that Vicki sent us earlier about the points you are interested in, primarily laying out the program design that Maryland DHCD, with support from the General Assembly and other input from stakeholders, deployed in the spring of this year, and an update on the status of that funding. And then we'd love to have a conversation after our slideshow. I just want to, end by saying for the moment that, we do feel like Maryland's program is the right design, and we are in the top 50% of groups in terms of deployment of resources across the country based on Treasury reporting through the end of August. We want to do even better than that. We want to be at the top of the 50% group. So you'll hear more about how that's unfolding from Danielle, and we look forward to your questions as we get to the end of the PowerPoint. And with that, I will ask Danielle to launch the PowerPoint.
Great. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Like Carol mentioned, we're really happy to be here and sharing the progress of Ewrap with everyone. and also talking through, I think, some of the challenges and pros and cons of the design that we do have. So hopefully everybody can see my slides okay. Can I just get a confirmation? Looks okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Great, thanks. So just to kind of recap how we have gotten here and where we are now. So before the new federal emergency rental assistance program came along back at the end of December, early January, the state had actually allocated a lot of funding to rental assistance through a lot of different sources. So local governments were using a mix of local, state, some federal funds for rental assistance from things like the CARES Act, coronavirus relief funding, all of that. So altogether, the estimate that we are aware of is about $113 million was allocated to rental assistance before ERAP came along. And starting with the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021, Congress finally appropriated a federal stream of funding specifically for rental assistance. So the first tranche of funding was about $401 million for the state of Maryland. And the way that the allocations work, it's split between the state as well as some counties receive funds directly. So counties with over 200,000 residents across the country were awarded these funds directly. And sometimes you'll hear us talk about the Maryland counties as direct grantees. Maybe we call them the Big Eight because they're the largest 8 counties in the state. So you might hear us use those terms interchangeably. Out of ERAP 1, $258 million was awarded to the state of Maryland, which is being administered through DHCD, and $143 million was awarded to those 8 counties with over 200,000 residents. So primarily Central Maryland, Frederick County, Montgomery, and Prince George's are the grantees in those areas. And then later in March, the American Rescue Plan Act was passed by Congress, and that appropriated another $352 million for the state of Maryland, which again was split between the state as well as those 8 same counties. So here's where you can see who those counties were. So the counties in blue are the ones that got direct awards from the Treasury. Green are the counties that are only able to receive funding through the state, so they didn't get those direct awards. And we at the state have the flexibility to award funds throughout Maryland. So we're not tied to just the jurisdictions that didn't receive funding from Treasury. We can serve the whole state, which has been really beneficial. So from the get-go, there was a desire to have public input into the ERAP design process. And one of the ways in which that happened was through an advisory work group that the governor asked the General Assembly to establish. So on your screen, you see the work group membership. It is a bipartisan work group. It launched in February 2021, right after we learned what the allocations would be for ERAP. There were 3 planning meetings held throughout February and March, and we've been reconvening again July through September to check in on progress of spending, talk about challenges with the program model or things that are working really well, and also just to get some feedback on how local jurisdictions feel about the program. They also were really critical to advising us on program strategy from the beginning, including everything down to how we would distribute funds, as well as what the formula would be to award state funds to our local partners. We also came up with some guiding principles for the state's approach to administering ERAP assistance. So there's 3 primary areas where we're really focusing our efforts. One is on making sure that we have an equitable program so that we're allocating funds based on need, as well as disparities across the state. There are certain groups that are more at risk for eviction that we're aware of, and we also know that need varies greatly by jurisdiction, depending on what the rental market looks like, depending on what the income looks like in those counties. And so we really wanted to have an equitable approach to how resources would be allocated. We also wanted to make sure that the program was low barrier. So we wanted to have affirmative outreach strategies. We also wanted to simplify the eligibility and screening process as much as possible. And we also wanted to make sure that we weren't duplicating efforts that were already in place. So As I mentioned before, there was already $113 million that had been allocated before Ewrap came along, and we wanted to make sure that the system we were designing for Ewrap was complementary to that and was not going to be duplicative of those efforts. We also wanted to make sure that we were able to do some bulk rental relief as an easy way to assist a lot of tenants at once by working directly with landlords. And so we do that through a few partnerships, one of which is administered in-house at DHCD. And then we also wanted to make sure that our process was locally driven. So again, we wanted to make sure that the assistance being delivered really took into account those local housing characteristics. It took into account the needs of those tenants locally, which do differ from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And we already knew that we had a network of trusted community partners across the state who had been doing similar work before, whether that be through homeless prevention or community action programs, and really scaling up what is already in place rather than replacing it. So one of the common questions we get is, why would the state not set up its own application process? Why would we work with local governments instead? So from the get-go, one of the things that we noticed is there was a really large mismatch of resources. So I mentioned those 8 counties that got funds directly from Treasury. Well, those 8 counties, they represent 82% of the state's renter households. The problem was that when Treasury funds got allocated, they were allocated based on just population. They weren't allocated based on number of renter households. They weren't allocated based on folks that might be living in poverty or below the income threshold for Ewrap. And so what that formula resulted in is only 36% of Ewrap 1 funds for Maryland were going to those 8 counties, even though 82% of the state's renters live there. So immediately from the beginning, we knew we had a mismatch of resources, and the state was going to have to take a more comprehensive approach to make sure we were right-sizing resources and making sure that we reserved a pretty large portion of the state funds for those 8 counties to supplement those existing federal awards. We also had an infrastructure in place. So those 8 counties, with those 82% of renters, most of them already had some kind of rental assistance application process in place. They had hired up some staff, and we already knew that they had about 25,000 households in the queue for rental assistance before Ewrap even came along. So we already had been working with local governments to launch their programs. They already were providing additional services, financial assistance, and legal aid through other types of funding that they were administering. So we wanted to make sure we were expanding their services and, again, not replacing them. And then the other thing we knew is that we wanted to prevent duplication of benefits as well as work for tenants and landlords to get assistance. So we didn't want to have 2 places that people would have to apply for assistance. We wanted to be able to direct folks to one county website or one portal that they would have to submit an application in. We didn't want folks to have to do double the work and navigate 2 different application processes. And then we also want to keep our eye on long-term housing stability. So helping folks get caught up with arrears is really, really important, but we also need to make sure that we're helping address the root cause of some of the housing stability issues that folks are experiencing. A lot of the households that we're serving with Ewrap are households who already struggled to pay their rent before the pandemic started. So we want to make sure that the program we're launching has a capacity to connect people to income, help them find higher paying jobs and workforce development programs if they need them, provide some on-site services, connection to enrolling in food stamps or other types of public benefits. And in some cases, helping folks transition to more affordable housing. If they're struggling to pay the rent, even post Ewrap, we should be looking long-term at helping that family get into a more affordable unit, in addition to helping increase their income. So this is what the funding framework looks like for Ewrap 1, which is where we are now. Ewrap 2, we'll talk about in a little bit, but that's going to be coming down the line. We're really focused on Ewrap 1 right now, which has to be spent by September 30th of next year. So as I mentioned before, $143 million was allocated directly to those 8 counties, the biggest 8 counties in Maryland. The state received $258 million. And the way that we're administering funds, we're doing some work in-house, and we are also working with those local governments. So we put about $193 million of our award out to county governments in Baltimore City to either create their ERAP program or to supplement their existing ERAP program. We also allocated about $40 million for the Assisted Housing Relief Program. That's a program that DHCD administers where we do bulk rent relief for tenants that are in properties who have worked with DHCD in the past with a financing relationship. So things like low-income housing tax credit properties, properties that would have received financing from DHCD in the past. So we already have a lot of their documentation on file. We're already really familiar with the owners. So we're able to offer bulk rent relief through that program where the landlord applies on behalf of the tenants. We kept about $20 million in reserves because we assumed that there would be some counties who spent their funds faster than others, and we would need to have some supplemental funds for them to continue their operations. And we're about to allocate those now. And then we reserved a small portion, about 2%, specifically for DHCD to administer the program and do a really progressive public outreach campaign, which hopefully by now folks have seen our flyers and our ads and our commercials to get the word out about ERAP. So that is where some of our marketing and communications comes from as well. And then a portion of those awards that go to county governments can be spent on housing stability services, which includes legal services, as well as administrative funding. So this is how the state URAP funds work. So you've got DHCD really deploying 3 different ways. So you've got the Assisted Housing Relief Program. We also have a grant with United Way of Central Maryland to do bulk rent relief to properties in the Central Maryland region. That's a collaboration between us, the county governments, as well as United Way. A lot of county governments didn't feel like they wanted to establish their own process for bulk rent relief. They wanted to tap into United Way's existing model that they had piloted with Baltimore County. And so we worked collaboratively across the region to have county governments set aside a portion of their funds specifically for bulk rent relief. So we have a grant with United Way to do bulk rent relief. The Assisted Housing Relief Program does bulk rent relief. And then we also have these county government programs, which are primarily focused on tenants who are applying directly to the program, as well as maybe smaller landlords who wouldn't qualify for one of the other big bulk rent relief programs. And out of the county government programs, what we're seeing so far is that payments to landlords account for about 95% of the payments that are going out. So we do have a really good landlord participation rate. And then about 5% of those payments can go to tenants when landlords refuse to participate. So if a landlord does say, you know, I just want to get my tenant out, I don't want to accept a payment from the program, maybe they're not willing to stop an eviction filing, then we can actually pay the tenant directly, who can then pay their landlord. And this is what the geographic distribution of funds looks like. So here's where I like to point out how the original federal allocation was kind of a mismatch of resources. So if you look at Anne Arundel County and Baltimore City, their federal funds that they received are almost the same because they have almost the same population. However, what do we probably all know about those 2 areas is that they have really different numbers of renter households. They have very different income statistics. Area median income is very different. And we also know that folks are more rent burdened typically in Baltimore City compared to Anne Arundel County. So there are some big disparities in who lives in those 2 places and how many of those households are renters versus owners. So when we went to develop the state formula, we took into account all of those things. We took into account the number of renter households, you know, the number of folks living in poverty, the number of folks that were rent burdened, and we came up with a formula that would help right size the allocations. So over there on the right, in the rightmost column, is the percentage of Maryland funds, whether they were direct or state funds that went to that jurisdiction. So that's the point of comparison between jurisdictions to see, you know, overall, how much funding do they each have to work with. And as I mentioned, there were a few counties who wanted to work specifically with United Way in the state on a bulk rent relief approach. There's a star next to the name of all of those counties that opted into that process. So some of them dedicated all of their state funding to that, some dedicated just a portion. So we have kind of come up with a custom approach for each county based on their projected need. And this is what legal services funding has looked like so far. So through Ewrap specifically, we know that about $635,000 has been allocated through the county grants to legal aid providers across the state. We have about $1.15 million through non-Ewrap resources. So as I mentioned previously, you know, our county governments as well as our partners have access to a lot of different funding sources. Some of which are better suited than others to supporting legal services. But there's basically four main ones there on your screen: CDBG, CSBG. There's also the Maryland Housing Counseling Fund and NHS funding. So altogether, we have about $1.78 million that has been allocated to legal aid services since the start of the pandemic. And in case folks aren't aware, this is just a link to our website. So since each county is administering its own program and application, we wanted to create a one-stop shop for the public to find their local program, get some basic information about eligibility, and also find out where they should apply. So rentrelief.maryland.gov is our main portal that we direct everyone to, and all of our communications are tied back to that website. So it does include a link to every single county across the state and their application portal. It also links to the Maryland Assisted Housing Relief Program application for those larger properties that have worked with DHCD in the past. And we also have some toolkits posted there with bilingual fact sheets for landlords to download and distribute to their tenants that are behind on rent. And then most recently, we added a data dashboard. One of the things that was really important to us was building transparency around how funds were being distributed and what the status was for each county across the state in getting those funds out. So we actually have the most comprehensive data dashboard across the country. There are no other states that have launched a dashboard that includes both state funding as well as their direct counties funding. So we work very collaboratively with the 8 counties in Maryland to get that data every month and make sure that it's accessible to folks. And typically the updates are about 30 days behind because we have to close out the month and then get that data in from our county partners, compile everything, submit it to Treasury, and then we can update our dashboard. So right now it's updated through August 31st, and I'll show you some screenshots here in a minute of the data. And very soon, in a couple weeks here, it will be updated to include September numbers. So there's a couple key components we just wanted to cover for Ewrap about who's eligible. So there's 4 different things that a household has to meet in order to be eligible. One is they obviously have to be a renter, so they have to have an obligation to pay rent. They also have to be below 80% of the area median income as defined by HUD. They also have to experience some kind of financial hardship related directly or indirectly to COVID-19. Now, directly or indirectly means that there's a lot of ways people can qualify. So things like staying home to take care of a child when school's closed, that would count as financial hardship. Or losing your employment due to the pandemic, that's a hardship as well. Increased utility costs because you're just home more often in quarantine or isolation or social distancing. So there's a ton of different ways people can qualify for financial hardship. It doesn't have to be just an income loss or increased expenses. It can be a lot of different things. And then they also have to have a demonstrated housing instability. So that usually is going to be documented by a past due utility or rent notice. They also could potentially qualify because they have unsafe or unhealthy living conditions. And then we're also allowed to establish additional criteria that could qualify for this. So for example, one of the things that we've chosen as the state is to allow folks who are simply rent burdened. So if they are paying more than 30% of their income on rent, we think that that makes them housing unstable, and therefore they would meet that criteria. So there is, you know, some local flexibility within the federal regulations for what we're allowed to do. And then the one thing I really like to point out is a lot of folks think EWRAP is just for people who are past due on their rent. But we actually can help a lot of people that are in different situations. So one is maybe they're up to date on the rent, but they had a sudden income loss and now they need help in the future. We can help people with prospective rent. We can also help people who are currently homeless or living in shelters who need to move into permanent housing. We can help them with security deposits, move-in costs. We can also help folks who, like I said, are in substandard or unsafe living conditions. Maybe they're in an overcrowded unit, they have a significant rent burden, maybe their utilities have been shut off and so they're at risk for losing their housing that way. We can help those households both stay where they are and rectify some of those conditions depending on the situation, or help them move into a new unit that doesn't have those same situations. And then we also can help households who have already been evicted. So if someone was evicted during the pandemic, either for failure to pay rent or they had an expired lease, maybe that's the way that their landlord evicted them, they can get access to this assistance as well. Maybe they've been living doubled up with family and friends. We can help move those households into new private housing as well. So this is what our numbers look like just through August 31st. And I have the next slide shows what our projections through September look like. So through August 31st, we approved about $135 million worth of assistance across the state out of the total $401 million available. As you can see, those bar charts at the bottom really show a big increase month over month of assistance going out. Most programs across the state opened up their applications in May and started making payments in June. So that's why you see such a big jump in assistance from May to June and then from June to July. We are right now, it's looking like September might outpace August, but we'll have final numbers here in a couple weeks. But at least through the end of August, we had distributed about 135 million and almost 15,000 households had been assisted. One thing I like to note is that right now under total applications received, it says 32,000. Some folks calculate the difference there and say, oh my gosh, 18,000 people have been denied, and that's not the case. So that difference in those two numbers includes people who may have submitted an application and it was incomplete, so it's actually still in progress. It also includes folks who have maybe been denied, and it also includes folks who are still pending review, so who are essentially in the pipeline to get assistance. So we are working on collecting more data about where people are in the application process, but for right now, this is what we have publicly available. And this just shows what our estimates are for through end of September. So one of the things that kind of has manifested as we've rolled this program out is we have really supported our local jurisdictions that got their own federal funds in spending those funds first. So because those federal grants can only be spent in that jurisdiction, they can't be used somewhere else, we have encouraged them to spend those federal funds first and then start tapping into their state funds. Because at some point, if we find out that those funds aren't needed, or maybe they're slow to spend them, we can always reallocate the state funds somewhere else across Maryland. So we're encouraging them to spend their federal funds first and then start tapping into their state funds. So that's why you see a little bit of a difference in the pace of spending for direct grants and state grants. But basically, we're projecting by the end of September, we probably made payments for about 146 to 150 million across the state. It might actually be higher than that based on some of the projections I'm seeing at this point. And then we also know that we approved about $30 million worth of payments prior to September 30th, where we know the check wouldn't be getting cut until October. So some of our bulk rent relief programs, the landlords, as they're waiting for that assistance, agree not to evict. And because they're such large applications, they take a little longer to process. So we know that about 30 million worth of applications have been approved for bulk rent relief that are going to be going through here shortly. So altogether, we're on track basically to have approved about 176, 180 million through the end of September altogether. This is just some interesting data that we thought would be helpful to show. The Maryland Multifamily Housing Association does a monthly survey of the landlords that are within their network, so mostly larger multifamily housing owners. And they collect monthly data on rental delinquencies. And so they were kind enough to provide us with some of their statistics for what they're seeing. So about a year ago in August 2020, rental delinquencies appear to be at an all-time high. About 43% of their owners were reporting that tenants were behind on multiple months of rent. That has since decreased to about 16.87%. So a pretty large drop over the last year. We definitely think, partly due to the emergency rental assistance that's going out. And over there on the right, you can see the cumulative ERAP obligations over time. So as one's going down, the other's going up. So there is some correlation there between those two data points. And then it sounds like you've already had some conversations with the judiciary, but this is some basic data that the district courts have provided us about failure to pay rent filings, dismissals, and evictions. So one thing we know is that both filings as well as evictions are down significantly from pre-pandemic levels. Typically in an average month prior to the pandemic, a failure to pay rent filing month would have looked like closer to 60,000, 66,000. That's now down to about 33,000 as of the most recent month we have data for. A good portion of those filings are being dismissed, and then evictions for the last few months have hovered in the 700 to 900 range. So I know one of the things that we had all been worried about and curious about was with the end of the moratoriums nationwide and courts kind of reopening because they weren't on the same COVID restriction protocols for dockets. There was kind of a national fear that we would see a big eviction tsunami, as you hear the term, or eviction wave. And it hasn't necessarily manifested that way. That's not to say it wouldn't change in the future. So we do keep a close eye on this every month, but so far, we have not seen a big increase in evictions just yet. So we will be continuing to pay attention to this over the long run as we continue administering ERAP assistance. And one thing I would just note is that our local emergency rental assistance programs are partnering very closely with their district courthouse as well as their sheriff's offices. So one thing that we try to do is have multiple touch points for rental assistance in the eviction process. So of course, we would love if people proactively applied and we were able to get that assistance to them before they would ever have to appear in court. But sometimes it doesn't happen. Sometimes people don't apply. Sometimes people might not know the assistance exists. And so one of the things we try to do is make sure that our rental assistance programs have access to docket information, know folks that are coming up in the docket for an eviction hearing, and can connect them with assistance at the courthouse. And we also want to make sure that our sheriff's offices have access to that same information. So several of the counties we work with have established a great partnership with their sheriff's office where the sheriff is contacting them before they go out to actually serve the order. Sometimes they have an ERAP staffer go out and actually go with the sheriff to provide someone with help on site. So we are trying to touch people at multiple points along the continuum and make sure that we have multiple interventions in place. And then next up we have ERAP 2, and I promise I'm on my last two slides. So next up is ERAP 2. We've been dealing with ERAP 1. We are starting to get a lot of really strong progress, and spending is ticking up. So we're anticipating that we're going to need to start making ERAP 2 allocations here in the next couple of months to continue some of those local programs. So we already know what the direct allocations look like from Treasury. So the piece of the puzzle that we're figuring out now is what should the state's allocation process look like? And that's partly going to be based on need. So what have we seen in terms of applications coming in for each jurisdiction? What have we seen in terms of the pace of assistance that needs to get out? As well as what have communities already been provided with from Treasury. So we know that for ERAP 2, most of it is the same regulations as ERAP 1. There's a couple key differences. One thing we know is that at least 90% of the funds have to be spent on financial assistance. Up to 10% can be spent on housing stability services, and that includes the case management staff and the program staff who are operating those financial assistance programs. So if someone's providing, for example, help with tenants' applications, or they're providing disability outreach services, those are all considered housing stability services and come out of that 10%. And then we also know that we have a slight increase in administrative costs. So those are capped at 15% under each of those categories. We also know that EWRAP 2 will allow us to extend assistance from 50 months to 18 months for tenants. Right now, they can receive a total of 15 months, but it'll increase to 18 months. And then something unique to EWRAP 2 that's not available to EWRAP 1 is once 75% of EWRAP 2 funds have been spent, we can potentially dedicate up to 25% or the remainder of the grant to affordable housing development activities. So we don't have any guidance yet from Treasury about how that will roll out or how that will happen, but we know that that's at least one option in the statute. And then EWRAP 2 works a little bit differently than EWRAP 1 in terms of how funds get to grantees. So with EWRAP 1, we got all the funding up front. With EWRAP 2, it comes in tranches. So as you spend money, you get the rest of your grant in multiple tranches. So we would expect that, come March or April, that's when we'll start to see additional rounds of funding come through. And then the first time that Treasury can reallocate out of EWRAP 2 and move money between grantees is after March 30th. And this just shows the timeline. So our plan right now is to really make sure that for those EWRAP 1 grants, folks who are coming up towards the end of their award, maybe they've spent more than they expected, maybe their pace of assistance was really fast, maybe they had more needs than they thought they would in the first round. Those folks that applies to are going to be able to start tapping into their EWRAP 2 funds. So the plan is really to provide a streamlined, painless extension of assistance that will help those local programs continue to operate. And I think that's the last slide for us. So happy to take questions and talk about anything.
Great. Well, that is a lot of information. It's a lot to absorb. We look forward to receiving the PowerPoint because I know there's a number of things I'd like to be able to dig into and look at more closely. So thank you very much. We do have a number of questions. I myself have a couple too, but we'll start with Luke Lanciano, who asks, why didn't Maryland decide to establish a statewide application platform for rental assistance like Virginia had done? Has such a consolidation been discussed or considered at DHCD?
Yeah, so that was definitely part of the initial planning process when we met with the General Assembly work group. So essentially, the reason we did not go with that approach is one, because of how Treasury funds were allocated. So we have a slightly different setup than most states because of our renter households being very densely located in just those 8 counties that got funds directly from Treasury. So that is different than other states. Not all states have had that similar impact, but essentially 82% of our state's renters, they live in 8 counties that got money directly from the federal government. And so if the state were to set up a application process for just our portion, we would essentially be duplicating what those local counties already had put in place. Now, Virginia is a little special. So Virginia had launched a rental assistance program back in 2020 before EWRAP even came along, and they chose to go with a state model for their application. So when EWRAP came along, their local governments decided they did not want to administer a local application system. They would rather just give their funds to the state. So that was one of the options that was available back then when it first started. But essentially Virginia and places like Texas, who are all kind of ahead of spending nationwide, the reason they were able to do that is because they had started in 2020 with a dedicated pot of state funding. And what you saw in Maryland is that we used a mix of local, state, and federal resources to get assistance out to people before Ewrap came along. So that hybrid approach, or that access to multiple funding sources, meant that those 8 counties in particular, where the bulk of renters are located, they already had an application process in place by the time Ewrap came along. I think one of the stats I put in the slides is that they already had about 25,000 households who had applied. So what if we would have established our own, what it would have meant is tenants and landlords having to apply again. Then we've got to do like duplication of benefits checks, and it gets a little wild. So that's kind of where we ended up with the application process.
And I see Carol wanted to comment as well.
Sorry.
Yeah, just to supplement what Danielle has said very well, at least one state that we know of that instituted a centralized process parallel to their bigger jurisdictions has seen like a 40% overlap in applications, which is in and of itself an inefficient approach. And the second thing we think is really important to consider for the long term is having locally based systems set up for coordination that's focused on eviction prevention amongst these agencies, the housing providers, government and nonprofit, and also legal services and courts and sheriff's offices. So it may be painful in the short term to set up the infrastructure, but in the long term, it should really benefit renters in housing instability because of these local systems that are being established.
Okay, thank you for that. We have another question in the chat from Pam. Baltimore City received 14.5% of the Maryland Ewrap funds. How much has been paid to the landlords? And then there's a follow-up question from Pam as well, but why don't we take that one first?
Yeah, I can't, I'd have to look at what the percentage is. I'd have to calculate that math, but I can tell you 13.2 million. And as of this month, probably about 16 million has gone out to tenants and landlords from Ewrap. There's a little delay in their federal reporting that a lot of people don't realize. So they haven't necessarily gotten credit for it yet at the federal level, but they're working on their reporting now. But they have used Ewrap to assist about $16 million for tenants and landlords.
Carol, did you want to follow up? I see your hands up, or no, that's,
yeah, I think
that's legacy.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Oh, that's fine. That's fine. Okay. All right. And another question regarding housing stability. You know, housing stability includes legal assistance in the definition. Would you consider providing Ewrap funds to fund the Access to Counsel in Evictions program? And is this under discussion in state leadership?
Well, one thing I want to point out, if my microphone's on, is if you go back to the program design for Ewrap 1, you'll see available in housing stability services out to the local governments. And they are using every bit of that to create the infrastructure locally, case management, and in some cases legal services that we absolutely understand is critical. But it's also critical to process this amount of funding to reach people and keep them in their homes. And there's, some governments such as Montgomery County have hired 45 people. Prince George's, Baltimore County, they're in the, they have dozens of people that they're supporting with the case management funding. So it is important to consider that we really want to establish and support the capacity needed to deliver these funds, and weigh that how additional uses of the funding might affect that core capacity. It's my recollection that the Access to Counsel group had estimated that there might need to be $30-some million a year or so to stand up in the longer term. regular access to counsel program. And in the near term, that's about what we have to just support the core capacity of local programs. Another source of funding, could be considered that is more flexible and broad, related to like the ARPA funds that the state has received directly and or have the larger jurisdictions have gotten.
Yeah, okay, well, would be helpful too. I think there was a follow-up question on the legal assistance fund, since that's part of our charge as a task force, obviously. So is to understand if we could have a breakdown or some more information about just exactly where those funds have been spent, how much and in what jurisdictions. That'd be helpful for us to know, to your point, that there's sort of an ecosystem being set up out there. The legislation, of course, contemplates that the money would go into a fund administered by the Maryland Legal Services Corporation as a statewide effort. So while we certainly appreciate all the local efforts, it doesn't supplant sort of our charge to look at how we can look at this more comprehensively as a statewide effort. Anyway, just an aside. Okay. So that detail would be very helpful for us, to know about the legal as a follow-up. There's also a question about, can you explain the process of connecting the resident to a better paying job? I missed that question earlier.
Yeah, so many of the county programs that have been set up include some level of case management or casework. That's offered to tenants who are applying. And so for a lot of tenants, that looks typically like at a minimum, making sure folks are enrolled in the benefits they're eligible for. So from an income perspective, you've both got mainstream benefits as well as earned income. So connecting folks to TANF, other types of resources like Head Start, things like that, OHEP for energy assistance, tapping those kinds of services, but also many of the local county programs are also workforce development programs or have access to those services at the local level. So they have access to job placement specialists. Typically, they also have partnerships with their local workforce development program. The folks who are actually carrying out services at the local level are typically community action programs, county government offices like their housing office or potentially their DSS local branch. So there's a lot of kind of cross-pollination of resources happening at the local level. And that is one of the, as Carol noted, that is one of the benefits to taking maybe a more state central approach, where they can really provide that legwork, that housing stability work at the local level. Each county's setup looks a little different. So some places maybe have a lighter touch on the services, some have a heavier hand. But as we go, and that's primarily due to our main goal right now is getting folks caught up on rent, right? So we want to make sure we keep people out of the eviction process. But as we start to transition into EWRAP 2, and those funds can be spent until 2025, we're going to be starting to focus more on that core housing stability work, because as we get folks caught up, they're not going to have 12 months of arrears. They're going to have maybe 1 or 2, and maybe they just lost their job and need to be reconnected. So the work is going to look a little different as we start to transition into the next year.
Okay, great. This question, let's see, given the importance of reaching landlords throughout this process, do you anticipate an effort to develop a comprehensive list of landlords by DHCD?
We will certainly have access to a lot of information. I will say, I think one of the challenges has been that there's not a statewide registry for landlords, right? So we actually in Maryland don't have a comprehensive view of who the landlords are in the state and how many households are renting from them and kind of what that looks like. So there's not a repository of that information, but we will through EWRAP have a lot of access to information about landlords. So every month our grantees have to give landlord information to us. So we're just now starting to work through compiling that, and we'll have a better sense of who are our frequent flyers for the program, who are the largest landlords we're serving, through the program and who are participating. And then, of course, those bulk rent relief programs, we have direct contact with landlords through those and are collecting a lot of information. So we will have some landlord information, but there's not kind of a holistic statewide view of who landlords are and how many units they own, unless they're participating in ERAP. So.
Okay, great. Thank you. There was an asked and answered question. I just wanted to say that I think it was Beth Harbor said, I understand Baltimore City ERAP is only paid to landlords on the tenant's behalf, but not to tenants directly. And Carol had responded that ERAP funds can be paid directly to the tenant if the landlord refuses to participate. And so far, 95% from your slides of payments have gone directly to landlords.
I will just add one thing. Baltimore City has not started direct-to-tenant payments yet. So they're trying to work through their policies and procedures on that now, but they have not yet started cutting checks directly to tenants. Okay,
and Beth also notes that in the chat as well. Is there a breakdown of funds paid directly to tenants by county? So I think there's an interest in that for, kind of more specific information.
We will have that. That'll actually be in our dashboard when we do our update at the end of October. So, and I can't recall off the top of my head if it's already in there. So much data flying around these days, but at least going into October, we will have data by county about how many payments were, what percentage of payments went to landlords and what percent went to tenants. And people will be able to publicly see that on the dashboard.
Okay, great. There's another question. This one's for me. Have you established the partnerships with courts and sheriff's offices? And how's that information been shared with DHCD or community partners? Like, how is this articulation going in terms of finding out who's at risk and getting resources to them? We're curious about that.
Yeah, so what we're hearing from our local partners, each courthouse works a little differently depending on how much how many people are on their docket, who their local administrators are. But essentially the folks who have established partnerships typically are able to get a list of upcoming hearings and station someone at the courthouse to be able to assist folks to apply. Most courthouses at this point, and maybe all, are distributing some form of marketing material about ERAP as folks are coming in for hearings. But the kind of information is a little different by courthouse depending on what that ERAP program needs to get in contact with folks. And then for sheriff's offices, they have individual relationships with their sheriff's offices to be able to connect with folks before the point of eviction. So in some cases, they're actually physically going out with the sheriff for eviction orders and notices. And in some cases, the sheriff's office might be giving them a heads up as to the folks who are at risk for an eviction.
I think we were more, I appreciate that. We were really interested in whether you're getting that information at pre-filing, at filing. We're considering that notice of intent and whether there's an opportunity there for folks to get connected sooner than later to resources and for our purpose, to legal assistance. Yes, Carol?
Yeah, just to interject that it is really important to have real-time data. And I think it's very difficult, from what we understand, for the courts to provide that because they have a largely manual system, not an automated system. I think that's a big issue to address, in the now, but certainly for the long-term success of coordinating between providers for eviction prevention, is that in real time, all of that information is paper-based, whether it's at the court or in the sheriff's office. And many of our local providers have developed some very effective informal relationships with these paper providers, these paper coordinators, to reach those folks who are on the verge. But that's a big barrier. It's very inefficient to be pulling together pieces of paper versus having a centralized system for information provision.
Thank you. Yes, we've aware that the lack of electronic information in real time is a challenge, and a challenge certainly in the implementation of this program to provide people that access. Okay, Rena Shaw had her hand up. Is your hand down, or are you still interested in asking a question?
Yeah, thanks, Vicki. I think you pretty much asked the question that I was going to, but I'll just follow up by asking, I think one of the main concerns may be that, or at least that we're hearing from legal service providers who, go to court and represent folks, is that the timing of things doesn't always match up, right? And so, I think if people are receiving rental assistance, but they have a court case, and making sure that, in the end, all of this money is coming to the state and to the counties for the purpose of keeping people housed. And just, why we think it's critical and why this law is so important is it is part of that stabilization. It is part of ensuring that once people receive the rental assistance, they continue to be housed and they don't fall through the cracks because of the court system. And, I think that data question sort of went to that kind of, what kind of coordination can there be to ensure that even after rental assistance is received, there's not a court process that, ends people up, having to be evicted. And so that's the piece really that, what are your thoughts on really trying to get to that issue that is of concern?
Well, we think that an automated system would certainly be more efficient, both globally for tracking statewide trends, but also at the local level. Right now we have a decentralized manual paper-based system, and it may be a very significant investment required to automate these systems, but it's a critical and crucial one. And right now we're very focused on catching up to people who are in the eviction process through our local partners. They are coordinating and catching up to this moving train, the court system, as best they can. But the barrier for the lack of automated information is significant.
Excuse me, may a non-task force member ask a question?
Yes. Go right ahead, please.
Oh, well, thank you. My name is Bill Orleans, and I was disconnected from today's meeting for much of it, but I called in, so I have a better connection. This question of an automated system, it's been my impression, explained to me a couple of months ago by a Prince George's CLS lawyer, that throughout the rest of the state, save for Montgomery, Prince George's, and Baltimore City, there is an electronic system called MDEC. And as I understood it, in the jurisdictions where MDEC has been implemented, those who would advocate for or assist tenants who have had a filing for eviction entered against them, just the filing, the preliminary filing, at the very earliest stage under MDEC, those tenants could be reached out to way before they would actually have a trial date or an appearance date. I don't know if that's accurate, but that's as I understood it. And my question has been, since I first learned that Prince George's and Baltimore City and Montgomery, although Montgomery was supposed to kick in its implementation in October, why some of the monies received last year and still held by the state could not be utilized to jumpstart the implementation of MDEC in the three remaining jurisdictions. I don't know if I've understood this well before I asked this question, or if you understand my question enough.
Okay, I think they are. There's nodding going on. Thank you, Mr. Orleans. We're going to let them answer that question.
Yeah, I mean, we're aware that there is a system that is more automated for some. I am not sure why not all counties participate in it yet, but that is one of the challenges, that some of them are dealing with, is not all counties participate in it. So I don't know if, Carol, you had any inkling as to why folks aren't in it yet, but.
Yeah, it's certainly assessing what systems are in place would be a great first step. I think that might require some funding for IT consulting services, for instance. But it's obviously not a sufficient system to allow for real-time exchange of information, or I think it would be happening.
And as we learned from the judiciary, because we actually covered this in our discussions on Friday somewhat about where we are in terms of MDEC, where the courts are. And there was an exemption for landlord-tenant court, not helpful either in this circumstance. So it is an issue, and the task force has noted that issue as a potential, and I think you said it well, as a barrier really to getting folks the kinds of eviction prevention services and particularly legal assistance they may need in that critical window. So definitely an issue there as well. So are there other questions? I'm noting in the chat how has the state taken Treasury guidance to using federal funds for funding civil legal aid? Because as you know, Treasury's relaxed a lot of those. We intend to meet with the federal folks too about those new rules and the easing of some of the restrictions. But if you could speak to that and how that's been incorporated, that'd be great.
Go ahead, Danielle.
Yeah, sure. So at least in terms of legal services, we did get clarification over the summer that we did not need to collect the same amount of detail from legal services providers as we did for financial assistance, which I think has been really helpful. So the reporting requirements are a lot less. Another thing that, and this is what I'm assuming Rena's asking about, so she's welcome to correct me if this is off track, but the other piece that we got clarification about just in August is when we can use self-attestation for eligibility. So one of the main challenges about Ewrap from the beginning as it relates to legal services is we had to document eligibility for the program. So receiving services was predicated on that household being below 80% AMI, having a demonstrated housing instability, et cetera, et cetera. And at the time, the regulations published by Treasury very much implied that you had to document income. So pay stubs, W-2s, all the things that went along with that. They finally put in writing at the end of August that we can allow self-attestation of income when documentation is not immediately available. So at this juncture, it is much easier to provide legal services under Ewrap in terms of documenting tenant eligibility for those services, which is great. But I think the main challenge really from our opinion, our side, is about the total amount of funding and how it's restricted, right? So we are required by statute to spend 90% of the funds on financial assistance, which only leaves 10% for the staffing that's needed to actually assist tenants to apply and provide services. And so what that doesn't do is leave a whole lot of money for legal services, right? So that's the point Carol was making, is the way the funding restrictions work. It really can be used for those core financial assistance programs, but really doesn't leave a lot for legal aid services at the end of the day. We have some counties who have been able to do that, which is great. So where we've tried to look for a solution is in some of these other funding sources that are more flexible. So where a whole grant can be done for legal services rather than potentially have to come out of, this very restrictive funding. So, but I will say the reporting has gotten a lot better, thank goodness, and documenting tenant eligibility for legal aid services is much better. So those have certainly made things easier for our folks we're already working with that are legal providers. But the real challenge is the overall funding structure, that we have to spend such a high amount of the program on financial assistance, which doesn't leave a lot for the staffing side of working with tenants, unfortunately.
Can I follow up on that? Thank you for answering that question. And that's exactly what, the kind of information I was seeking. So when you all mentioned the ARPA funds earlier as a possible source, can you describe those a little more? I know we're familiar with Ewrap and sort of the timelines and when those need to be spent. Can you remind the task force of the other funds that you're looking at and the timelines and numbers associated with those?
Yeah, Carol, you probably know this better than I do. Oh.
Information that we have, I have to say, we've been laser focused on getting the money out for eviction prevention, but I will send the task force through Vicki information about ARPA. Similar to ERAP, there's a big allocation that's gone to the state that the legislature and the governor have made some agreement about as to how to spend. And that's something you should look at, is how the legislature and the governor have discussed how to allocate this large, billions of dollars pot of funds. And then there's another very large segment of the ARPA funds that have gone directly to the largest jurisdictions. And then there's another set of funds that have gone to the smaller jurisdictions from the state. And there's a wide variety of uses that those funds can be used for. That do have, it has to have a COVID connection, but I think frankly there are a lot of jurisdictions kind of really in the thinking through stage of how to use their local allocation. Baltimore City, as you may know, has a whole public agency process, and now they're transitioning into a nonprofit request for proposals process for ideas for the use of the $600 million or so that Baltimore City has. And I do not know, but we can try to find out if there are any unallocated ARPA funds that the state has, but that is probably something known between the two houses of the legislature and the governor's office.
Okay, that would be helpful. And Rena Shah, who's leading our outreach and assessment committee, is interested in knowing who the best contact would be to follow up regarding the outreach. Is that you, Danielle? Okay.
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about that. I'll drop my email in the chat.
Okay, great.
Yeah,
and one
the outreach strategy,
sure.
Just to supplement that, of the 2% of ERAP admin funds that DHCD has, which is about 5 million, about 3.5 million of that is dedicated to targeted outreach, communications, and community engagement. And we have been in close, regular contact on this with the CDN group, Community Development Network. I don't know if we have a meeting coming up, Danielle, or we've already had it to give them.
It's coming up. It's coming up in. Oh gosh, I don't know the date, but it's coming up towards the end of the month, I think, where we're specifically going to cover outreach.
That would be great. Maybe that's an opportunity for our committee that's focused on that to either join in that conversation, so you don't have to double dip.
We'll make
that would be great.
You know about that. Our communications, our Office of Public Information is going to provide an overview of the investments we've made and the outcomes from them.
Terrific. And there is another follow-up data question, and that is the average time between the application, the rental assistance application, to kind of getting the payments out the door, getting that out. That was another question.
Yeah, that's data that we're just now getting in from jurisdictions, so I don't have an answer yet. But most of the application portals opened in mid-May. So, we're about 4.5 months into the process. I will say just anecdotally, I think it differs a lot based on whether it's a rural suburban area versus one of the big 8 jurisdictions. So the rural and suburban jurisdictions almost exclusively are processing within 14 to 30 days. One of the challenges that I think maybe not everybody realizes is we are required by federal regulation to outreach for at least a week to landlords before we can proceed with assisting tenants. So it's in an effort to get them to agree to landlord concessions and also accept payment directly. So we may approve a household as eligible, but then there's a delay in payment depending on whether they're able to secure landlord participation. So, but most of the rural and suburban areas, they're processing within 14 to 30 days. The urban jurisdictions had a bit of a backlog to work through in the beginning. So we'll have better data here in the next month or so probably, but on average, applications are getting processed under 30 days in rural areas, and obviously a little bit more in the bigger areas. And a few of the counties, as they get like eviction orders in from the courts, are prioritizing cases to the front of the line. So it's not a linear process, right? It's not necessarily first in, first out is kind of the challenge. And the other piece too is we're required by federal regulation to prioritize applications from folks who are 50% of the area median income and below, and or unemployed for 90 days at the time of application. So there is a prioritization process that happens behind the scenes to meet those regulations.
Thank you. That's helpful. Carol, did you have anything else to add to that? No. Okay. All right. Thank you. Lots of good information. Are there other questions from my colleagues on the task force? I'm looking at the chat. I don't see any more in the chat. So we'll see with that. Okay. All right. I don't see any further questions, so we don't want to hold people longer than we have questions. I see one. Beth, if you want to just unmute and ask a question. I know you're typing. You're welcome to do so. Oh, it's just a thank you. So I will add my thank you, not just a thank you, but thank you so much to Carol and Danielle for coming to this session, to presenting and giving that information, and for the follow-up information that you've agreed to give us. I really appreciate that. That's, I think, one thing we will want to follow up with you. We really do think there should be funds set aside for this program, to begin this program. We're sure that that's a good use. Other states, we've met with other jurisdictions, and it's not a one thing doesn't solve a problem, but rather you need, as you well know, the range of efforts to help really be effective in our eviction prevention efforts. And we see access to counsel as one of the pieces, the critical pieces in that eviction prevention landscape to help get good outcomes. So we hope to engage with you on that further because we think that's critical. Pam, I see that you have your hand up. Go right ahead. Please unmute and just ask.
I apologize for coming in.
No worries.
Thank you. Danielle, I just wanted to mention to you that we're seeing a lag time of at least 3.5 months from the time the application is placed with the agency and the time that we're getting information back from them. And that doesn't even include payment.
Which jurisdiction?
It's Baltimore County, primarily. Howard County seems to be going a little bit quicker, but definitely in Baltimore County, there's a delay.
Yeah, I know they are either have or are about to. I don't want to lock them into it. I do know they're actually standing up call center folks to be able to help folks check the status of their application. But there was a delay for a while as they were switching funding contracts with their nonprofit providers. So I do know there are some folks who have been waiting a long time. But let me look into whether they've officially stood up their call center folks and if they have like a better number that folks can use. But I'm happy to connect offline to get you in touch with the right folks.
The call center really doesn't have anything to do with it because we're doing it as a bundle. But what's alarming is that our residents are calling and they're very fearful that they're going to be evicted. And we are, even on weekends, responding to our residents saying to them, please don't be worried, you're not going to be evicted. But I think that when they were giving paperwork saying that it would be 2 to 4 weeks, I think actually in the beginning it was 2 weeks, then it went to 2 to 4 weeks before they would have a response. And now it's been 3.5 months. I can understand why they're upset.
Yeah. And so when you say bundle, that means you're participating with United Way.
Yes, we are.
Okay.
And I know that Scott is doing his very, very best I know that they're constantly trying to hire people. So I'm not faulting United Way, but I just want to set the record straight that the payments are not coming out, unfortunately, as quickly as we had hoped.
Okay, I think we have a little background noise. Okay. And then I would just say, it was mentioned by Rena Shaw, the Access to Counsel program is a scaled approach, because we realize, it's going to take some time for all the reasons we've just talked about, data, connecting, process, all those things. And so the first year would not be an incredible investment. It scales up as the program scales up. So again, we saw that effectiveness really in eviction prevention really requires some investment in access to counsel too. That's what we've learned from our other jurisdictions. So we, again, just sort of put that out there for you, for your consideration. And I'm sure you'll hear from us again on that, but, but we appreciate it nonetheless. Okay. All right. With that, then I am going to conclude this session if there's no more questions, and I don't see anything else in the chat. And with our great thanks to you, Carol, and to you, Danielle, and we'll look forward to getting some of that follow-up information we discussed, as well as the PowerPoint, so we can really dig in, and appreciate working with you on some of the outreach, because we know you're really engaged, deeply involved in that and immersed, and you can teach us some things about that as well, those efforts. So thank you.
Thank you and the task force members for all your work. This is very important.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, everyone. And to the task force, I'll be sending you an email just to kind of wrap up. We don't meet again as a plenary for another week. I know that Carol had mentioned that there's later data coming, so we'll look forward to that update because they have some reporting to do to Treasury and other things. So we'll look for some updates later on. But thanks so much, everyone, and we'll be in touch soon. Take care.